There we go. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. And let me turn my camera on. There we go. Okay. Thanks for joining. I hope you all have had a good week and appreciate you tuning in for another session of the BEPS Stakeholder Advisory Working Group. My name is Sam Furio. I'm the outreach lead for MDE's Building Decarbonization Division. I'm going to be your moderator for this afternoon session. If you are here today, you most likely already signed up for this working group, but if you just so happen to receive this invite from someone else, please make sure you sign up for our email list to ensure you get the latest on scheduling and updates for this working group. And Zach just went ahead and dropped that email list link in the chat. So we will go ahead and pin that and make sure it's available throughout. And so today, as a part of this working group, we'll be diving further into long-range implementation of the Building Energy Performance Standards, or BEPS program, and our focus areas over the next few months for this group. And before we get too deep here, I'd like to introduce Dr. Zach Brazola, aka Dr. Decarb, Division Chief of Building Decarbonization Division.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Excited for the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Zach. And so, yeah, I'm going to kick us off with just some preliminary information, some updates for you all, and then I'm going to hand it over to Zach to walk you through some technical nitty-gritty today. We're getting into the weeds, so hope you all are ready. As always, this session is being recorded and uploaded to our Maryland Department of the Environment BEPS Working Group YouTube playlist. That is where we archive all of our working group recordings. I'd note it is different than our regular YouTube playlist. So if you're looking for all our content, I'd recommend you tune into both of those, and they're both available on MDE's YouTube channel. As always, we'll share a link to the slides in the description of the video after it is uploaded to YouTube. And this session, and as kind of the ethos for this working group, is going to have an opportunity at the end for discussion. And so to partake in the discussion, just all of you have, are able to unmute. Just raise your E hand at the bottom center of the screen. It'll add you to a queue. And then when we call on you, just go ahead and unmute and share your thoughts. Kind of depending on time today, we'd ask that everyone keeps their comments to about 1 minute. And if additionally you would prefer to write out your thoughts for that discussion section, the chat feature is enabled, so you can feel free to write your thoughts and we can read them out loud to everyone. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. There we go. Okay, so agenda for today: BEPS status, where are we now? And recap of last session for this working group. We're going to go through House Bill 49 implementation updates, reviewing some of the focus areas for this working group over this upcoming year. We're going to review existing target setting methodology, and that's where I'm going to pitch to the doctor to walk you through the details. And then we're going to get into discussion and scheduling for next session. So that's the run of show. Before we get into that status update, just for those of you that weren't able to attend last session, kind of the purpose of this working group, why we're all here, is there is a lot to be done for BEPS between now and 2030 when the performance standards start. So, this year and the next 5 years, it's just benchmarking for building owners. Those performance standards start in 2030 and beyond. So between now and then, there's a lot of work to be done. And so this working group is being assembled to inform programmatic changes and long-range implementation of BEPS, and also provide us consistent structured space for stakeholder feedback. So we'll have that posted there for every session, just to keep our eyes on the prize. And so as per usual with our webinars, got to give a nod to the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, which set Maryland on a new path to reduce its climate pollution. The Climate Solutions Now Act set very ambitious climate goals for Maryland, some of the most ambitious in the country. And those goals are to reduce GHG emissions from all sectors by 60% by 2031 and achieve net zero economy-wide by 2045. So very ambitious goals. One of the critical areas for emissions reduction is the building sector. In Maryland, it emits more than all of our power plants combined. So there's a substantial amount of emissions there that we can work on reducing. And part of the plan for reducing the emissions from the building sector is BEPS, why we're all here. And that's specifically for large buildings and aims to reduce emissions, energy costs, and improve air quality. So if you want to read more about the state's plan to hit those goals, you can read the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan on MDE's website today. And so let's just get into a status update on BEPS. It's almost the end of January 2026, pretty crazy how fast we're moving along here. We wrapped up the first year of benchmarking for statewide BEPS, which is a big milestone. So thank you all to everyone who participated in the adoption of BEPS and provided feedback during that. And for those of you that did some benchmarking or exemption form submissions over this last year, we appreciate your efforts and in making this first year a success. So first year is wrapped up, and that wrapped up last fall, 2025. And around that time, we sent out quite a few letters called Notices of Required Action, detailing the requirements of the program and what needs to be done. And so, we sent out quite a few, and some are still landing across people's desks. So if you know someone, or if you yourself encounter a letter, and you don't know what to do, just read the checklist on the back side of the letter and use that in tandem with the benchmarking guide, which is on our website, to kind of get you across the finish line if you need to benchmark. If you want to submit an exemption form, you can do that on our BEPS portal, and benchmarking or submitting an exemption form will satisfy that notice of required action. So that's what you need to do if you or someone you know received one. Kind of an update on building statuses from this first year. So if you submitted benchmarking prior to January 5th, 2026, you should see a status on the BEPS portal. You're looking for a status that says data received. That means we're able to see the data and review it. If you submitted your benchmarking and you don't see a status on the BEPS portal, then it might be worth double checking just some minor tweaks in your portfolio manager submission, just to make sure that we can that data is flowing correctly to us. So I just advise getting onto the BEPS portal if you did your benchmarking and checking those statuses. If you submitted an exemption prior to December 15th, 2025, you should see at least a waived status in the BEPS portal. If our compliance program got to your exemption form prior to December 15th and made a determination, that determination should be available in the BEPS portal as well. So if you're waiting on that request, maybe check out the BEPS portal. And if you're not sure what your status means in the BEPS portal, we have a handy BEPS portal user guide that has a list of definitions, and that can be accessed through the BEPS portal. At the top right of the screen, there's a big blue help button you can click on to get there. And for you folks that maybe submitted exemptions, or you got friends that submitted exemptions, just all you need to do, if you submitted that form, you're in compliance. You just need to wait for our email with additional information on your determination. So our compliance program will get back to you with more information, so just hang tight. And if you need additional time, we are, for your 2024 benchmarking or exemption form submission. We're offering extensions until February 17th, so just under a month from now. All you need to do is email us with your unique building ID, and we'll work to get you that extension. And so looking ahead for BEPS, where are we going? So, we wrapped up that first year, but the next deadline is right around the corner, just about 4 months from now. And so by June 1, 2026, building owners need to submit their calendar year 2025 data. And this is a big year for benchmarking because this data will need to be verified by a third party. So we have more information on the third-party verification process in some other webinars we just ran, and also our benchmarking guide as well. But prior to submitting your data or sharing your data with us by June 1, you'll have to have a third party sign off on it for accuracy. So that's the big change for this upcoming reporting cycle. And we'll also get into, in a little bit, some other important points about this calendar year 2025 data. Again, as I said, 2030 and beyond, these covered buildings need to start meeting emission standards or pay for excess emissions. And in addition to that emissions standard, we do intend to adopt an energy efficiency standard next year, 2027. That's crazy to think it's already approaching, but that standard's called Site Energy Use Intensity, or EUI. And so, we'll be getting into that a fair bit today. So, look forward to that, but that's what we're planning on doing next year. And additionally, House Bill 49 that passed the 2025 legislative session set some new requirements for BEPS that MDE is implementing over the next few years. And if you're curious about all this and more, you're in the right place. This is the working group for all of that implementation and feedback on these bullet points. And so just another reminder, if you were forwarded this invite from someone else, I just want you to get on this email list so you can always receive the latest from us. And so before I hand it over to Zach here, I want to do a recap of the changes that are coming to BEPS from the House Bill 49 that passed 2025 legislative session in Maryland. So I'm going to run through everything on this screen here, and Zach just dropped the House Bill 49 text in the chat, so feel free to read that. It's there for you when you need it. And so first things first, buildings in Montgomery County, which has their own BEPS program in the county, are totally exempt from the statewide BEPS program. And status update on that one, that's good to go. So if you're a Montgomery County building, you should see a waived status in the BEPS portal. And so we're moving right along with that one. Next up, hospitals are now eligible for total exemption from the program. They do need to apply. And that exemption form for hospitals is now available for submission on the BEPS portal. And additionally, so there's some energy exclusions that are available for buildings with sensitive compartmented information facilities. And that guidance and related forms are in development. So make sure you get on our email list to make sure you get the latest on the SCIF exclusion. There's also a $100 annual reporting fee that will be assessed per covered building. And that reporting fee became effective on October 1st and applicable for all subsequent reporting years. That is currently under construction, and so make sure you get on our email list to hear the latest on paying that reporting fee and payment instructions. And additionally, we've got some additional energy exclusions for steam sterilization equipment and backup power. for specific facilities. Those forms are available on the BEPS portal as well. And finally, we've got some credits that are available for on-site renewable energy towards the EUI standard, which we'll get into a little bit later, and then biomethane for the GHG standard. And guidance for those are in development, and stay tuned for that to be released soon. So that's kind of update on some critical HB 49 changes and where we are with implementation of those. So just a recap on last session, we proposed some topics for this working group to focus on. And we also opened up for feedback for additional topics that folks would like to discuss. So on the screen were topics that MDE proposed to review as part of this working group. That is the interim net direct emissions standard, the energy use intensity standard intended to be adopted next year, and specifically its interim and final standard portion, as well as the associated alternative compliance payment values. And then additionally, implementation of those House Bill 49 requirements that I just went through. And so, as part of this working group, we released a form for additional topics. And I think, we're pleased to see that I think we're pretty aligned on the topics we all want to focus on, and almost word for word. So folks submitted that they were interested in reviewing the UI standard, specifically target calculation, the reliability of data under those specified targets, alternative compliance pathways for energy intensive or unusual property types, and then finally the ACP values for EUI. Folks were reviewing the requirements of House Bill 49 and some of the considerations that the department needs to make for specific facilities, and folks were saying that they found the current flexibilities adequate for some of these building considerations. So thanks for that feedback. And then finally, people wanted to review the net direct emissions interim standard, specifically in regards to the difficulties that buildings face in electrifying major systems and end uses, and the possibility of offering building and performance plans as alternatives to that, and also wanting to dive in on the calculation of interim standard 1 for GHG, which is and it's 20% reduction. And then finally, additional modeling on heavy ups or service upgrade costs and delays for buildings. So thank you all for that great feedback. And, again, just glad to see that we're step in step, I think, with topics we want to consider. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zach to kind of walk us through nitty-gritty on standard setting.
Thanks, Sam. And put on your thinking caps today. I know we've got a lot of material. We want to do a recap for everybody that's maybe just joining us for the first time today. And then I'm going to go in pretty deep here. If you've been with us on the BEPS journey for many years, some of this will be refreshers, but it's been a couple of years since we've talked about this. So we wanted to bring us all onto the same page. So I'm going to go over how we arrived at the standards that are in the BEPS program today or were previously proposed as part of the BEPS program, and then we'll get into discussion. And so I'm just going to dive right in, and then we'll go to questions. So the baseline benchmarking report, which is going to be submitted June 1st, 2026 for calendar year 2025 data, will establish will kind of be the data we're using to look at the kind of future of the BEPS standards. And so we're going to be looking at the data and seeing if the interim standards we had previously, so again, for everybody, just to start at the front, the emission standards, net zero 2040 by 2040. And then there's these two interim standards, 2030 to 2034 and 2035 to 2039. And so when we are talking about the emission standards and standard setting, we're really talking about the interim standards for the direct GHG emissions. So for that, we're going to be looking at the data we get this year that's been third-party verified and understanding what that, seeing how that compares to the original standards we set and seeing if we need to make any updates. And then the energy use intensity standard, we're intending to adopt this in 2027. And we originally used a straight line approach to final targets, and we'll talk about how we got there in a minute. And so that's kind of our approach. And again, we'll be using the data we get this year to help set and adjust those EUI standards for the future. So what data did we use to actually do this initial targeting setting back in 2023 when we first put forward the BEPS program? So that data was based on the State Departments of Assessment and Taxation. We did an analysis to find the approximately 9,300 covered buildings we thought were in the state. Obviously, that number is changing every day as we hear from buildings that are on the list, buildings we thought were on the list that aren't off the list. We determine exemptions. I just looked this morning. That BEPS portal has over 10,000 buildings with a building status on it. Many of those are determined exempt. They're not part of the program. They were never part of this. They weren't part of that 9,300 number in the first place. Some of those are buildings in Montgomery County as well. So lots of, and a lot of buildings are benchmarked, which is great. We're seeing some pretty good compliance for the first year of the program, and we're going to be working really hard over this next year to kind of bring that compliance rate up towards where we are, where it really should be for kind of moving forward. So that was the start, and then there's about 3,000 buildings that had previously benchmarked in Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and that are in the state of Maryland. And most of these were in Montgomery County, but some of them were voluntarily benchmarking in other parts of the state. And that data set, the EPA, which runs the Energy Star program, was able to grab the data and send it actually to the national lab partners. And they did this analysis for us. We actually never saw the data, but they're the direct data, but we kind of have an understanding of what it did, and then the back end of what this would project to for our covered buildings. And they also leveraged the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey and the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. And just, again, for those that maybe weren't with us, the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, a US Department of Energy laboratory, did all of our analysis and data analysis and helped us do this kind of standard setting for the policy. So that's where all of this original work was done. So when we talk about actually setting that emission standard, what did they do? And I started to hint at this earlier, right? So starts with the final standard, 2040 and beyond, all buildings must achieve net zero direct GHG emissions on or before January 1st, 2040. So that final standard is set in law. That's kind of is the post. There's not much to talk about there on that one specifically until we talk later about potential strategies and other things. But in terms of the actual standards, 2040. Then there's the interim standards. The legislation specifically says that BEPS buildings need to achieve a 20% reduction in net direct GHG emissions on or before January 1st, 2030, compared to 2025 levels for average buildings of similar construction. And so that's the interim standard one, was how we set that. And we used the buildings, that benchmarking data set we previously had, said take all those buildings, find a 20% emissions reductions by property type, and then that set the interim standard one. Then interim standard two basically said, okay, 0 is the end state, 20% is interim standard one. Halfway between those two is going to be a 60% reduction in net direct GHG emissions for that interim standard one starting in 2035. And so it looked at the benchmarking data we had, again, then took a 60% GHG reduction and based that on property types. And so for those of you maybe, I'm guessing most of the names in this chat here today, I think we've interacted before, so you're familiar with BEPS, but we have about 90 different property types. And each of those property types, when they set the standards, they actually looked and said, here's the baseline performance we expect for this property type based on all that benchmarking data. So this, for example, an office building in Maryland, we expect it to have, I'm making up the number, I could pull it up actually off pretty quickly, but say it has 2 kilograms of CO2e net direct emissions per square foot. And that's how they set the standard, or that's how they set the baseline. And then they looked at it, take 20% off that. So we got to get to 1.6 by 2030. And then they said, okay, let's get 60% reduction. So that's going to be getting to 0.8 by 2035, and then said 0 at 2040. So that's how those interim and final standards were set for emissions. I'm gonna keep moving. Probably could have had a graph for you all showing that, but hopefully you understood my that it's a pretty straight line approach for how it went. We had a baseline number, it took 20%, took 60%, 0. And it set those based on all the property types. Then we get to the energy use intensity. And so the legislation requires us to have energy use intensity targets as part of the program. And so we initially put those out. The legislature asked us to pull those back for a bit while we took a look at the benchmarking data from 2025. So we'll be doing that after the June 1st deadline this year. But we have the data from 2023, which is based on those, again, about 3,000 buildings that had benchmarked initially. And so Sam just dropped in the chat the initial EUI standards we have, again, just to help orient folks on where we are thinking. If we're going from 3,000 buildings to well over 9,000 buildings, probably when all is said and done. Again, final numbers to be determined exactly on how many are benchmarking, but so there's an increase in sample size, but it's not many fold. And so we're expecting that the EUI numbers might shift a little bit from where they were. If we use the same methodology, they might shift a little bit, but they'd probably fall along a similar path. Because as you look at lots and buildings, the kind of differences between individual buildings falls out. So how do we get at those EUI standards? They used empirical data and benchmarking, that same data set that I was talking about. And then they use this methodology that Stephen Winter Associates developed for Montgomery County, who has their own BEPS. And the study really focused on energy use reduction opportunities and the costs in Montgomery County buildings. And so they set a couple of different ways to do target setting, but the main one, and this is the same methodology that Montgomery County ended up using, their targets end earlier. And so ours go a little bit deeper than the Montgomery County targets, at least in certain property types. The final targets were set based on this methodology called Zero Net Carbon Compatible that Stephen Winter Associates developed. And their whole report's out there if you really want to dig in and get deeper. And it was incorporated in our original technical support document for the BEPS regulation. The description Stephen Winters uses for this, it sets the target to a level stimulating the electrification of fossil fuel end uses using market-ready technology in an energy-efficient building. And that energy-efficient building, they're basically looking at a slow increase as well. They're looking at this kind of slow increase of energy efficiency, about 1% a year, that has been pretty standard in the industry. And so that's kind of this background level energy efficiency happening over the course of the 15 years that this policy is in place. And so that's driving a part of it. And then the rest is, as you electrify, it's one of the deepest forms of energy efficiency, since electric equipment operates at much higher efficiency than fuel-fired equipment. So you can see some really big efficiency improvements through efficient electrification. And so that's kind of how they set that 2040 target. And again, we're called on standards. Standards generally fall at the median. And so that's how we approached the EUI as well. So looking at the median from all these different buildings and getting our way down. And then the question was, well, we have a 2040, but we want to work our way in. The way that we did this is the same approach that Montgomery County took. It's a trajectory model. Basically say you want to end up at this final standard. Every building has their initial baseline for EUI, and then you do kind of interim standard 1 and interim standard 2, walks your way down to those. essentially the same as that kind of 20 and 60%, similar to the way that the GHG is done, but each building sets their own baseline. And so if building A here has a much higher EUI today, they still have to end up at the final target, but they have a gradual slope along the way to get there. And that kind of, their net EUI reductions are higher because they've got to get all the way down, but they do it in chunks, and they don't have to all reach a target that is, set in stone and much lower early on. So that's how that trajectory model worked. Okay, that was a lot of information. We're gonna get to discussion about this in a minute, so I'm just gonna plow along for another minute. But the kind of key policy questions that HB 49 wants us to contemplate is, and we covered these somewhat last time, but just to reiterate for those that are new here, how to calculate an alternative compliance payment for EUI standards, identifying financial incentives to be included as part of a simple payback period calculation for buildings around cost effectiveness, and then how to address covered buildings that, despite incentives and avoiding penalties and fees, would not achieve compliance. And again, I'm just rattling these off from HB 49. If anyone wants to go back and look at the text, it's a little harder to read, but it's the same bullet points. And then how to consider a whole bunch of building types and like specific considerations. So really where we're focusing on right now for this group, we can deal with the 3 later bullet points are going to come later in our discussions, not today, in future meetings of this group, because there's definitely a lot to think about for these. But we're really thinking on the EUI standards as well as both the ACPs for that, and as we have the conversations, anything to think about with the EUIs. So just to also frame for us, what are other EUI ACPs that are out there? So Washington, D.C.'s BEPS has a kind of they have a target, they have a fee, they use the Energy Star score as part of their program, but the kind of EUI is implicitly part of that. And so they have a fee of $10 per square foot of covered building that's kind of out of compliance, specifically with those EUI. And so it's basically like a $2 per square foot fee. That's what DC uses. And they can reduce those for buildings that make progress but fall short of their targets. So if building A was supposed to do a 20% reduction and they only get halfway there, they pay half of the maximum fee. So that's the way it's set up in DC. In Denver, Colorado, they have a fee of basically 70 cents per, well, long story short, it basically ends up being, their standard fee is 10 cents per kBTU per year over the standard, and it's 23 cents for the kind of higher tier of buildings that are over. And so this kind of range of 10 cents to 23 cents per kBTU. So that's really one of the best examples of an existing program that has a specific per kBTU ACP. And so that fee goes down to 5 cents per kBTU for buildings that exceed the targets by less than 5%. So if you're very close, it's a 5 cent per kBTU in Denver. So that's just an example of what the Denver has. It's kind of, again, the closest we've got to a specific kBTU fee. And then Washington and Oregon in their BEPS, they have $5,000 per year base fine for not meeting the standard, and then $1 per square foot per year additional for not meeting their program standards. And they've got this hybrid approach there. There are different pathways in the Washington and Oregon BEPS. They're set up a little bit differently, but in general, they have an EUI target as part of their building performance standard as well. So they're kind of taking the DC, dollar per square foot approach. So that's just a little bit of a landscape of what the EUI ACPs look like in other jurisdictions to kind of prime our conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam for the discussion questions. I'm going to take a drink of water because that was a lot of information, and we're excited to dive into the details. And I'm happy to go over any of these if went too fast or you want to ask some clarifications and get back to one of the things we covered.
All right, thank you, Zach. And yeah, so for this discussion portion, everyone should be able to unmute, share their thoughts. If you want to raise your hand and get added to a queue to unmute, that'd be helpful just so we can make sure everyone gets a chance and we're not talking over each other. So see a couple folks have already raised their hand. Thanks for doing that. And I just want to, before we go to that queue, if you want to share your thoughts in the chat as well, feel free. And then if something pops up to you later after this session, we're going to have opportunities for you to submit thoughts and materials to us via email. So don't stress if you can't get everything now. But just for this discussion portion, I'm just going to go through one by one and through these questions, and I'll put up supplemental slides just so we don't have to memorize everything we just gave you. But first things first, well, I guess let me just call on folks that have raised their hand to see what you guys are thinking about first. So bear with me one second. All right, Julian, you were first in the queue. So if you want to come off mute, let us know what you're thinking. Go for it.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. Really appreciate it. So real quick, regarding the site EUI, and I apologize if you've already answered this, but for the site EUI standard, do you plan on using, just like Montgomery County, the weather normalized site EUI, or like DC, the site EUI adjusted to current year, or just the general site EUI?
Yeah, I can take that question. So I think we are currently looking at weather normalized site EUI as a kind of reporting metric for buildings. So that's where we are today. And that's kind of what we've been thinking about, but obviously we're kind of opening the book here to talk about everything. So if there's within the parameters required of us by the law, like we can definitely take feedback if you're saying that you think site EUI is better than weather normalized site EUI, for example. But I don't think the way that I think DC does it, theirs is really tied to the Energy Star score and kind of a bunch of pieces going into that. And I don't think we want to introduce that complication here.
Great, thank you. And I'm all for the weather normalized, sorry, site EUI. So happy with that.
All right, thank you, Julian, for sharing. And next up in the queue, we got David. If you want to go ahead and unmute whenever you're ready.
Yep. Hey guys, how's it going? Thank you guys for the presentation. So quick question and kind of point of clarification. So I think Zach, you mentioned that as you guys are incorporating site EUI, you're going to look for calendar year 2025 data to be a baseline. And I was wondering how that was going to work with what we already have established for the GHG emissions, where there's no baseline, there's just set targets that have to be met. So is it going to be like there's different compliance pathways, like buildings can take on site EUI reductions in phases like in Montgomery County, or they can meet the yearly GHG standard? Yeah, let me know. Thank you.
Yeah, David, good question. So there's a couple of parts to that. I guess I'll start with the first one. The way that the legislation was originally written, buildings would meet both GHG and EUI targets. And if you looked at kind of how, and I maybe didn't explain this very well, but the way that the EUI targets were set basically assumed that most buildings were making the kind of 2040, the final EUI target assumed that buildings were achieving the net zero 2040 direct emission standard as well. So they kind of are set in tandem. And so that's really how the targets were previously set. And that's the assumption here, is that this is a dual standard program where you're meeting both. Now, I will say, I think something we've talked about, and last year when we talk about ECPs, the idea would be that if there's you're meeting both, but if you're not quite meeting both, or you're deciding to make an ACP payment, that the ACP payment would only be the higher of the two of the GHG or EUI. Like you're only paying ACPs for one of the standards, basically, which is something at least we had discussed previously. So I definitely wanted to bring that up here. So that's kind of how that's set. I can go back to the first question about like how it interacts with the GHG, if that you still have that question.
No, that answers my question. So just to be crystal clear, so as of now, the thought is that building owners will meet both the standards kind of on their own individual timelines, because the EUI is going to be different for everybody, right?
Yeah. If we just reinstated the EUI standards and language we had previously, the EUI targets, the timeline would still be 2030, 2035, 2040, like as the major kind of mileposts. But what the EUI target would be for 2030 and 2035 would be building specific. And it's based on that kind of their decreases on their pathway to the 2040 final target. So like the way to think about it, I think for kind of in general, the interim targets are basically there to help building owners make progress towards 2040.
Right. So it'll be the same setup as Montgomery County.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks for that, David, and Zach for the answer. Just want to see if anyone else had any initial thoughts. Ooh, got a hand. John, gotcha. Feel free to come off mute whenever you're ready.
Yeah, hi guys. Thanks. I don't know if you were going to get to this later. My question was about the suggested discussion point around energy intensive property use types and how maybe whether there's alternate compliance pathways or something like that. If you're planning to cover that later, I'm happy to save mine until then.
I think feel free to pitch your thoughts now. I think anything's fair game, and
okay.
We've got and if you want us to throw back up some of the EUI slides, we can do that as well. But
no, so
yeah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, just to lay out my concerns, and I'm sure you guys have heard this from any number of quarters, that so I'm with Verizon. We operate a number of telecom facilities in Maryland, right? That the fundamental problem with using EUI as an energy efficiency metric is that the sort of economic activity of the building is contained within the electricity that is being consumed. So in fact, increased energy density is sort of often more efficient than the lower EUI that you'd see in an office building or residence. So we've seen a lot of different approaches to this. Obviously, we operate facilities across the country. We're covered by Colorado's rules, by New York City's rules. Everywhere else there's BPS, and pretty much everywhere we've seen some version of the rules for energy intensive property types like ours. So whether that's a PUE target in lieu of an EUI target, obviously the direct GHG makes sense in this situation. It's just that we're looking for if there's been any discussion about alternatives to EUI targets for an energy intensive use type.
Yeah, that's a fair point to raise, and I think this is that when we talk about special considerations, this is a good thing. Like we should definitely, I think it's noted. It's something for us to think about. And if you want to share any specific language where you've seen that in other jurisdictions, we're happy to take that as feedback. I think the challenge we've run into, and the reason it is set as EUI targets across all our property types, is that's the legislation specifically says to advance EUI targets. And so that's something where that's kind of a discussion point of, well, we're required to do EUI targets. How do we kind of work in that space, and or try to put forward in our report that, well, maybe we should consider EUI target alternatives for certain property types.
Yeah, I guess I would just point you towards the Colorado BPS rules. They have a data center pathway, which is sort of applicable to this, and it involves submitting an energy audit, an ASHRAE level 2 energy audit, and some benchmarking data, and then being assigned a sort of custom PUE target. And I see Chris talking about that. PUE is sort of the standard metric for energy efficiency. Data centers, folks probably know this. But anyway, that would be my, I would advocate for that. Although I don't know if that solves your issue of the legislation actually specifically requiring an EUI target. So I don't know how that works.
We can definitely take a look at the Colorado legislation for that specific consideration and take that under advisement for sure. Louisa and Chris, I'm guessing this came up over this, and then Alexandra, I saw you put something in the chat. We will get to you in a moment. It sounds like if these questions, Louisa and Chris, are related to what John just said, I do want to kind of maybe close out this conversation before we dive into other bits. But if you have something else, we can wait.
I was going to say, if Chris is going to be talking about the PUE, why don't you go first, Chris, and then I'll just jump in about other things about the EUI target setting is what I've got.
Oh, I was actually going to go on PUE and to some extent the interim, early stage interim targets. Some different considerations on that. So I will, I'll hold those for a few minutes. Okay,
we'll come right back. I do just want to, quickly address. I think Alexandra was asking about state budgetary challenges, and I think that's and funding limitations. And so I think that's a great conversation as we start to go down the. There was that line in there in HB 49 about special considerations about buildings that just can't meet the targets or something like that. So I think that's maybe just put a pin in that one. And part of that too is just having the conversations about, well, this just needs to, it is eventually just going to need to get done. And that's Alexander, we can talk separately at some point, but some of this is just state of Maryland internal figuring itself out. All right, Louisa and Chris, back to you all, I guess. Louisa, maybe you want to go first, since it sounds like you were both talking about a EUI target setting.
Yeah, but if Chris is talking specifically about the PUE, why don't you go first, and then I'll jump in.
No, Louisa, you go first. I'm going to probably be talking for the next hour. You're good.
So just whether it's the interim or the final EUI target setting, and Zach, you've and Sam, you've heard me sing this song before. There are a lot of office buildings. There are a lot of multifamily buildings. There are a lot of warehouses. There's a lot of retail. So there's a nice big sample size. I would like to see some study on some of the rarer types, or some of the types where there is inherently more variation. I know a couple of the ones that are constantly on my radar as Montgomery County buildings, detention centers. I can't believe that there are that many detention centers that were actually benchmarked anywhere. And some of them might be something like a work release center as compared to a 24/7 facility with its own laundry and kitchen like we've got. Some of the things like the dormitory type, where it's, is it something that's primarily a 9-month school system, or is it something like an emergency shelter where, again, we've got people in there year-round, possibly 24/7. And so just to have study, potentially including the people that have buildings of these types, to say, look, these are the things that can really make our numbers, between my dorm use and somebody else's dorm use, can really increase that difference, or my detention center and the fact that there's only 2 other ones being measured. In some ways, kind of like what the National Aquarium did, where they said, hey, we're the only aquarium, we need some special methodology here.
Yeah, Lisa, that's a great question and point. I think one of the things we're doing and planning to do is, as we get this 2025 data, and we're looking at the 24 data as well to kind of help us understand that as we kind of wrap up the collecting all of it, but we'll see for the push on 25 getting even more, looking at those property types where there might not be a large number of buildings benchmarked in that property type. And that's something where maybe that's something as we get a little further down this pathway, we can kind of bring to this group some of the property type counts. And so I definitely welcome feedback if anyone wants to weigh in, if they feel strongly, you know, what a minimum level might need to be for a specific property type before we need to think about looking elsewhere, looking to other places in the country, looking to, you know, grouping a couple together if we have to, or going a different pathway.
And I just suggest it's not just the quantity, but it's also the standard deviation. So if you've got only 5 properties and they all range with an EUI between 60 and 65, okay, not a big deal. You've got 10 properties and they range from 30 to 150, that's more of a big deal.
Yeah, that's a
Sorry,
great
my
point.
engineering stat class is coming back to me.
No, it's a great point. Yeah, that's how you determine, you know, kind of confidence intervals in all this. And the other thing I'll say, I do think we put it in. We're doing an update to the benchmarking guide. We're hoping to have it out here in the next couple of weeks. And one of the things we're kind of highlighting in third-party verification as well, in that is that the kind of occupancy data. We really want folks to try to fill out that occupancy data, because a bunch of folks have raised it as a question. You know, how does this differ if we've got really different, you know, 24/7 use versus something else? So we're trying to use that occupancy data to dig in a little under the hood there. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so to possibly help Louisa out a little bit on the less common property types, you might have looking at benchmarking, like public benchmarking results from other jurisdictions with benchmarking. Like the problem with detention centers is getting an N equals large enough to be able to get a standard deviation, right? And so you'd have to look for I would look for other jurisdictions that have benchmarking requirements, rather than going back to a data explorer for whatever that's worth. Ideally, right, you actually also have monthly data, so you could do even some form of regression to try to take a shot of what might this building look like in our climate zone. That might be a bridge too far. But DC, Zach, I see you laughing. DC does have monthly data in their disclosure. Just saying it's possible. I don't know if it's likely. It's worth a shot.
Yeah, I'm mainly laughing because of we have a very short timeline to do all this analysis, and I didn't quite maybe lead with that up front, but one of the reasons, and we'll talk about this a little bit, we are getting all this benchmarking data June 1st, and we have a report due to the legislature with all this analysis and new changes by the end of the calendar year. So we have a pretty short window to do analysis. And so, Chris, I'm mainly laughing because I think I agree. There are some things where it'd be great if we had more time, we could really dig in on some of these things, and we've just got to figure out how to do our best, and then maybe see if there's any of these property types where we need to, you know, flag these for additional thought and consideration.
Yeah, I'm thinking for some of the less common property types, you may be able to grab that data now. Maybe able to do some of it prior to 2025 benchmarking data landing in Maryland. I was going to totally move to another topic, though, if that works for y'all.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so your first question around interim greenhouse gas target setting methodology. Did you put the actual text of the law up on one of your slides somewhere earlier? Because I think I have an option for you, but I want to see if this actually makes sense. Average bill, okay. I wonder if so I guess for context for other folks, I looked at the impact of the proposed interim targets, the first interim target for direct greenhouse gas emissions for Montgomery County, and it ended up as like a 45% reduction in that particular building stock. Might have just been because of issues with the underlying data set, but regardless, I think there's something in how you could potentially define like average buildings of similar construction to basically like reverse define, hey, this is how you get to a 20% reduction. Your analog here is going to be what Denver did by setting, they went back to look at their BEPS law, and basically went, oh, in order to meet the requirements of this BEPS law, we actually don't need to have any building reduce, in that case, energy use by more than 42% to be able to meet their climate goals. So in this case, your legislative goal is a 20% reduction in your legislative goal is a 20% reduction. You probably have some flexibility in how you get there to in effect create like at least a cap for that first interim standard. That 45 to 50% number is important in this scenario because that implies electrification of at least one end load.
Yeah, whereas the envisionment behind 20% is do some light weatherization, do some, if you're ahead of the game, great, but the idea is really doing small work, doing weatherization, doing some controls, you can get pretty far. So I think, Chris, I guess what you're trying to say is maybe look a little bit more holistically at the building stock. Is that right?
Yeah. Like ideally, right, you could, the universal way to define this, if you're legislatively locked into this 20% reduction, and I'm going to set cost wholly aside for the time being. But if you're legislatively locked into this reduction, now all of a sudden your average building of similar construction is the one that is 20% away from that target. Like there's some way to do that I don't quite have the language worked out yet. But when I was looking at this last year, that was kind of the way that I was settling out to it. Like there's a way to adjust that bar so you get this 20%.
I guess, Chris, I'm going to ask you to kind of maybe dig in on that a little bit. And if you want to come to our next meeting with like a little bit of a proposal for how you would instead. So, and maybe I'll also, we'll bring a slide next time with a little bit more clarity on how this was set for each building. Because I think the EUI, everything hopefully made sense, but this one, I was explaining it, but I maybe didn't explain it well. And it might elucidate kind of what you're thinking about, Chris, versus how we did it. I was honestly
I was looking through the comments that we submitted, trying to figure out if I actually put in suggested alternative language or not. I don't think I did, but I can double check.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's not language, if you've just got a little bit more to help everybody here see what you're trying to say, what you're kind of proposing as the alternative approach to setting that target. Yeah, feel free to, we can definitely bring that to the next meeting. And if you shoot us an email ahead of time, we can actually put it in the slides.
Yeah, no problem. Crap, sorry.
It's all good. Yeah,
the other,
Chris, go for it.
I don't know what to do with this yet, but interim target 2 2035, this is going to be related to electrification. This is going to be one of your electrification end load one of your electrification of end load targets. As a result, this is going to have some interaction with cost effectiveness. I don't know what to do with it yet, but I am flagging that.
Gotcha. Thanks for that.
And I will just mention on that, one key thing to take note of in Maryland, the kind of cooking end use is excluded from commercial cooking is excluded from BEPS. And so that was like, when we do the analysis, that's kind of already taken out of this. I know that kind of cooking electrification is often one of the harder to electrify in some cases, just because of the kind of electricity requirements and new wiring.
And thanks, Chris, for that thought. And Alexandra, just saw your message in the chat. regarding HB 49 is there, or can we add any consideration for on-site renewable energy generation where we do not own the RECs? Zach, you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah. So Alexandra, the way it's worded in the legislation, and I'd have to go back to we could bring this up for next time, but it specifically says for on-site renewable energy. And so when you don't own the RECs for renewable, like, let me just give an example and help make this a little bit less esoteric. If you put solar panels on the roof of a building, you're generating green electricity, that's on-site renewables. Great. If you then sell the RECs for those panels, that electricity generation on your roof is now basically just grid electricity generation, because the utility that buys those RECs is using your green attributes from that rooftop solar to meet their requirements to green the grid. And so essentially, when you put solar on the roof, but you've sold the RECs, that's no longer renewable generation. It's just grid electricity. And so in terms of the requirements in HB 49, that kind of doesn't really jive. So that's, I think, the challenge there in terms of crediting. It's supposed to be on-site renewables. And if you don't own the RECs for that electricity, it's not, it really isn't renewable generation. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the only thing I just wanted to ask that question because we are kind of in a very long-term contract for our current solar panels. So, I don't anticipate, unless that there is a change in that legislature, I don't anticipate that any solar energy that we generate would be able to be counted. Is that correct?
Yes, and again, we haven't had our lawyers go too down far that rabbit hole yet. But that is my understanding of how the legislation is worded, is you need to retain the RECs. So it would not count towards the site EUI credits that is in HB 49. Yeah, Julian.
So, doesn't solar help, whether they sell the SRECs or not, meet the ultimate goal of essentially reducing energy usage and electrification?
You mean just towards the ultimate kind of goal for the building?
For Maryland, right? Like, if the goal is to electrify as all buildings in Maryland, right, that are above 35,000 square feet, and at the same time reducing their energy usage so that we don't need as many new power plants to generate more energy, right? Wouldn't it be more beneficial to have as many buildings to go solar, regardless if they sell their SRECs or not, or go through a power purchase agreement or roof lease, a third-party agreement, to reduce the energy that they need from the grid, from utilities?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I agree that in general it is, building more generation in Maryland is kind of helps that out. My point to that, though, a little bit is that if you sell the SRECs, then that is actually then reducing the kind of generation that would otherwise be built to meet the generation needs, the clean generation needs in Maryland. And so it doesn't, if you sell the SRECs, like if you don't sell let me do the counterfactual, I think. If you don't sell the SRECs, then that kind of building, then there might have been another solar power plant built elsewhere in the state to meet the state's renewable energy requirements. And so that's kind of the counterfactual there, I think.
Okay, that makes sense. And then is this replicated from what MoCo was doing? Because I didn't look specifically on how they were going to implement that regarding solar and selling the SRECs and all that.
Honestly, off the top of my head, I know they're crediting it against the EUI standard, and I forget what their policy is on REC retention, but I can look into that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And just along those lines, John, just added in the chat for support there, that this, what Julian was just mentioning is exactly why some jurisdictions explicitly allow this double dipping, at least in the first compliance cycle, and referencing local law 97 in New York. So thanks for that chat message there, John.
John, just to make sure that I understood that, basically in New York City, they say, at least in their first compliance cycle, you're allowed to get towards in New York City case, the GHG goal with on-site renewables, even if you sell the RECs in the first one because it's building more. Is that what you're saying?
So it's functionally that. I think that's not exactly how it works, because most of the solar in New York City is not like rooftop. It's mostly community scale projects. But anyway, the point is and they explicitly allow double dipping, and they say, yes, this solar is helping the state meet the RPS, but it's also allowed as a deduction for 97 because it is exactly what Jillian said, that it's like achieving the goal, and it's like over the short term to allow things like the contract that I think Alexandra, which has been in place longer than this law has been in existence, allow you to use that and give you a little bit of time in advance of the second cycle to build the structures to be able to comply in the future. Again, I know you guys are constrained by the actual legislation on some of this, but if there's a way to sort of allow that transition period where you recognize the value of an on-site system, even if you don't own the RECs, on an expiring basis or something, that would be maybe something to consider.
Yeah, that might be a flexibility we could talk about. Something I think I'm hearing, John, what you're saying is you maybe allow it in. You can use it for the first interim standard, for example, but it wouldn't make credit towards the final standard. That's something where you could phase out its ability to credit if you don't retain the RECs.
Yeah, something like that. I think that's the idea. Giving someone time to say, if you're going to sign a new PPA contract that's going to take you to 2050, you now know that you have to think about RECs, and whereas you didn't if you signed it 10 years ago.
Yeah, that makes sense. Louisa?
Another possibility might be to use a system somewhat like in LEED, where you get partial credit for, you get full credit if it's on site and you retain the RECs. You get partial credit if you're buying it from somewhere else or if you're selling the RECs. And that might, administratively, that might be easier than figuring out terms of PPAs, but just something else to consider.
Yeah, the kind of a tiered system to how much credit is allowed. I like that suggestion too. This is why we have this group. Everyone has good ideas, experiences with other jurisdictions, and we're trying to kind of piece together all the right pieces here. Alexandra?
Yeah, sorry, I just had one follow-up question kind of going along with what you just suggested. I wanted to just confirm, if we are given off-site RECs as part of our PPA, those we also do not get credit for. Is that correct?
So you are retiring RECs, but they're not necessarily the RECs from your rooftop?
That's correct.
Great question. And honestly, I don't know the answer to that one. And it's
that's better than a no.
That's a gray area for me that is a known issue I need to ask our lawyers about, because I don't think we've figured that one out. Because I don't know that we figured that one out.
Yeah, Chris, go for it whenever.
Yeah, to kind of close out this kind of thought process and tie in something else that isn't directly related to this conversation, but kind of the PPA contracts and equipment lifespan. Thinking about those two things, what those things are, right, are existing things that existed kind of at the onset of BEPS that don't perfectly align with the schedule of BEPS, and how that gets dealt with would need to be explored. I don't think it's going to be necessarily this meeting, so flagging that if that isn't already on the future list.
Yeah, so basically, Chris, and this came up in legislation last year as HB 49 was being considered. it didn't make it in the final language, but basically for systems that were installed before 2024, I think was the year they put in, there was kind of some grandfathering, whereas anything after that had to be, really in compliance.
I was thinking that plus the implementation waiver that was in one of the preliminary versions. So for those of you that were not following the day by day of HB 49, first off, congratulations. Second, there was a one-time, or kind of a I'm gonna call it cycle because I'm reading DC lately, like implementation waiver, basically saying, hey, we're going to be doing this work, but instead of it happening by 2030, it might happen by like 2033, and so you had to do these steps. And by doing, and like, hey, once you finish this work, we'll meet an interim standard, or meet a final standard. And you have to, there's some other steps along the lines, but like there's something like that seems related here too.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, maybe it's worth us, it's kind of done and dusted in some ways, but maybe it's worth bringing back a couple of those concepts from last year, because I think most of them just got struck out at the end. But there was a lot of thought that went into a couple of these different pathways. For example, one of the potential flexibilities that had been previously raised was if you could provide a plan showing you were going to, your equipment wasn't out of lifetime till 2033, as you said, you could kind of push off interim standard 1 till 2033, as long as you were going to kind of make up the difference, I think was one of the iterations. So as long as you had a plan that showed you were going to get it by that time. And if you didn't make the plan, then you kind of had to pay what the ACPs would have been otherwise, something like that.
Yeah, that was, I think, one of the versions that, there's a couple other things. I think I think I have like old language from 49 floating around somewhere. Zach, I can send you a couple of thoughts on that, but that was one of the things that popped up.
Yeah, this definitely goes into some of the like flexibilities and stuff that we're not quite in the flexibility moment right now, and where we're trying to go with the working group, but I think it'll help us tee it up for future discussions. So
Right.
I definitely want to, and I know some of that factors into the EUI targets anyway, so we definitely do want to get into that when we can.
Yeah, and to that point, I was going to pivot to the EUI targets.
Go ahead.
So for context, for those of you in DC is standing up as part of their BEPS task force, a task force looking at an alternative pathway for BEPS Cycle 2 on long-term trajectories. They had a study released in 2022, and I can drop it in the chat when I'm done talking, that use the Climate Neutral Cities Alliance methodology as their standard setting. So it's the same underlying methodology that Montgomery County used. That methodology, and Sam helpfully dropped this in the chat earlier. If anyone's curious, you can follow along in Appendix 7 of the Montgomery County Technical Report. But that study basically assumed baseline efficiencies of equipment and proposed new efficiencies of equipment. It's on page 182 of the study. I, quite frankly, don't know if those efficiencies are being borne out with equipment today. I do plan on bringing this up in I'm also on the DC subcommittee. I plan on bringing it up there, and I think they might have more bandwidth to investigate kind of, what are we seeing in terms of like as operating equipment. I'm happy to port those results along, Zach, or connect y'all directly, but I think it would make sense to, like, if we're looking at this in literally a next door jurisdiction right now, to see what they came up with.
Yeah, feel free to bring those along, and we can definitely also connect with DC separately.
Thanks for that, Chris, and just wanted to read out Louisa's comment from the chat, confirming that to keep flexibilities, alternative plans for compliance for future considerations, and that information will be helpful for owners that are not commercial real estate based, like government, nonprofit, and multifamily. So thanks for that, Louisa. Anyone have any other thoughts they'd like to share?
On interim, I think you're, again, I've been looking at a lot of different BEPS models lately. They all seem to use straight line for interims, and I think it's one of those scenarios where each building is not actually going to have a straight line methodology, right? Because every single building, you cannot uniformly reduce energy use by, you can probably do about like 0.1 kBG per square foot, but like you can't uniform, like at some point you run out of the ability to do a straight line reduction for each building. So each building's reduction is going to necessarily come in chunks at some point. Unfortunately, what that means on a policy basis is now you're stuck with a bunch of buildings that are doing these things, but on schedules that are subject to their specific equipment, which is to say that I don't think there's much you can do on the target setting methodology, but to Louisa's point, it does imply like having sufficient flexibility mechanics built in to particularly interim standards in this case, just to identify that, like, hey, you might not like based on just the nature of the equipment in the building. Like we may have this option where we like can't necessarily do a perfectly straight line reduction.
Yeah, and Chris, I think some of the other jurisdictions have handled that through, like Montgomery County has their BEPS, which allows you to kind of set out, we're getting towards the target, but we're kind of going on a little bit of a different path there. I think that the challenge we face with the state is the scale, right? There's a lot of buildings. We just physically cannot review BEPS for every single building. Or if we were to be doing that, the staffing we would need would be tremendous, and then therefore we would need to pay for that, which would require large fees on the kind of BEPS plans. It would probably be the only way that would be possible. And so like this is the thing we're trying to figure out, and it's one of the many things in HB 49 we got to think about is like what's the staffing cost, what's the cost on buildings to do it, the feasibility. The idea with ACPs has always been that it lets you figure out exactly what the plan is for your building that works based on the economics of it, right? You make the economic call about what that pathway looks like. You go as far as it makes economic sense in whatever year makes economic sense for you. And then there's none of these, the plan gets dreamt up, but that's kind of on the building owner to implement. I think one of the things from my perspective, at least, that, if we could think about without having to go all the way down the BPIP path, is there a way we could make a, somewhere in the middle where it's, well, we'll hold off on the ACPs if you kind of say in a test, we will meet this early, or we will meet this at this time, or we will overshoot in this year, like going some of the way there and then adjusting the ACPs accordingly. That's maybe something, at least that I think could be a potential. Then there's the question too. Yeah, I don't know. There's a couple of different options or flexibilities on that front.
Louisa, I think you had your hand up first. So that was, yeah.
Just to kind of follow up with that. So, we've been doing decarbonization audits on some of our BEPS buildings, a little more than a third. And we are finding that in many cases, quite often for emergencies, we've had to replace equipment in the last 5 years. It's good for another 20, but it's fossil fuel fired. And so, the plan, the decarb audit, is based on, well, okay, we'll replace this at year 15 out or 20 out, or and try and sequence stuff. So yeah, if we can present some of that information in some form, and Zach, yes, I understand the headache of trying to review all of these things, because I just had enough of a brain melt from trying to review the 10 for our buildings. I wonder if an option might be, just as you're having the data verified by somebody, if there can be some sort of verification or a food provider or something. And again, maybe it's a matter of like there's a verification data checklist of saying these are the things that you need to do a study and you need to include this information, and someone someone reliable needs to check that. The other thing, to go to the ACPs, and of course we don't have ACPs for the EUI yet. Can I use a few more initials in here? So we couldn't actually, we didn't want to use the proposed numbers from the previous bill because we didn't know that they were, whether they were going to be there or not. So we said, we don't know, there's going to be something. But looking at just the ACP cost for the GHGs, that's not a major factor in any of the decision making on which options to go, even whether we're going away from fossil fuel or if we're putting gas boilers back in. It's not the maintenance cost. It's the utility. It's not the capital costs. It's the actual fuel costs that make the difference between the options in most cases. So the ACP, if people are actually looking long term, I hate to say this, they're not high enough to really have an effect. And with the EUI, it may need to be higher to really give people something, an incentive to say, yes, I need to do this, rather than just saying, I'll just pay. And it's a policy balancing act, I know. Okay, done on my soapbox.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah.
And
So
thanks, Louisa. There's a lot to think about in that, and I think that's part of the conversation to have when we set that ACP rate.
yeah, and I think so, Zach. I wanted to go back to what you were talking about regarding kind of timing and BPIPs. I totally understand, or sorry, timing BPIPs and ACPs. I totally understand the concern about getting 10,000 individual BPIPs. That terrifies me. As somebody who might be stuck reviewing, who might have been stuck reviewing 10,000 BPIPs, that's a lot. But the flip side of that is, let's say I need to spend 500 grand to complete this project in 2033. And I need to accumulate 500 grand of capital to be able to do so. I can't get a loan for whatever reason, so I just basically have to set aside reserves. And I can set aside reserves of 100,000 a year. And in 5 years, I can replace it. Cool. If I have to pay 50 grand in ACP every year from 2030 on, now I can't implement that project until 2036, something like that. So it's actually probably 50 for one cycle and be 75 after that. So at some point, like, I've now had to delay this project by, half a decade for the purposes of paying ACPs. I don't think that's what I think MDE's intent here is, to drive efficiency projects and not create ACPs. So if that's correct, then finding some way to balance that with BPIP / not BPIP, so that money can actually be invested in projects, would make a whole lot of sense to me.
Well, I will say, and this is, I don't think it ended up being in the actual final language in HB 49, but it was there at one point, is that the whole goal of the ACPs is to redirect them back towards building owners. Now, the way we kind of set it up is, and the way it was envisioned last time, was to redirect it kind of towards our generic pool of funding towards building energy efficiency and electrification programs. So that was kind of the vision we've had. It is technically not right now written in the law that way, I think, unless it made it in and I'm forgetting about it. But that's like halfway there, Chris. I don't know if it quite goes to your question.
Not exactly. The other thing I was going to point out there is that DC tried that too, and their equivalent alternative compliance payments are now going into the general fund. So
Isn't
that money may not
DC
be available for bail. That money may not be available for buildings.
Chris, hasn't DC just added to the guidebook? I know the changes are being reviewed, but that you can reinvest the penalties that are that are sent to you for not complying.
The short answer is there's a methodology for that. The long answer is there's a methodology for that that's not defined in dollar value. It's super nebulous. All of which is to say that I might know the answer to that in like 5 months.
Oh man. Okay.
Now to close the guidebook comment, they closed it, I think, a week ago today. In full disclosure, AOBA did submit comments. In full disclosure, I took a shot at rewriting that agreement. Also in full disclosure, I have no idea what DOE thinks of it. I don't know if they're going to come back with something else entirely different. I don't want to tell you anything more beyond that. We'll see what the final version looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. The way it was worded in HB 49 last year was specifically, and this is how it's being done actually now for solar as well, or has been proposed for solar this this legislative session is actually specifically in the legislation designating it. Any alternative compliance payments have to go into an escrow account for use specifically to fund, in this case, solar, purchases of solar, like a big procurement of solar installations. That's this one proposal. And I think something like that in Maryland law with a future bill would kind of eliminate that you're grabbing this for general funds. I think if the law specifically says it has to go into a fund only meant for building upgrades, like it would be lawsuit territory and I'm not supposed to comment on that kind of stuff, but like if someone were to try to raid that for general fund money.
You're not allowed to comment on that. I potentially can, and I will just simply note that laws can be adjusted. If there is a law that is created in 2027 that might formally set aside, and there's some other problem that happens in 2031 and they need to borrow money, there's nothing necessarily stopping them from modifying that law. Which is to say that I don't think that method is probably the ideal method for managing this. Also, there's a bunch of questions on electrification and data center costs buried in the chat. I'm going to get out of the way of those.
Yeah, happy to. So just to maybe read out the question in the chat is basically Julian is asking about the kind of rising electricity rates and the cost to electrify, and how could we allow compliance through site EUI reduction that isn't tied to electrification or GHG emissions, or could we allow that? And so I think Julian, what you're asking for, and feel free to just chime in, is kind of an alternative compliance pathway that isn't necessarily meeting the targets exactly. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, or setting new standard scores that aren't tied specifically to electrification, but more focused on efficiency in general, right? Just trying to reduce the energy these buildings are using, making sure all their equipment is new, that they're maintaining all the equipment, so on and so forth, right? For buildings specifically, and I don't know, maybe setting this up so that buildings that are dealing with financial distress, for instance, that cannot afford a heavy up, right? And then have to pay for all of the equipment that they have to replace from gas to electric. We're just dealing with this a lot in DC, and it's in DC, they're not forcing electrification, but in order to get any incentives, right, you have to go with an electric equipment. So the issue we're facing, especially with community associations, is they don't have the money. And a lot of them are going through financial distress, and thinking about even doing a heavy up is not feasible. So that's why I think, and I'm sure you've been hearing from Maryland CAI a lot about this type of stuff as well. that people are afraid that they're not going to be able to afford a heavy up alone, right? That their buildings cannot handle the additional load of electric equipment switching from gas to electric. And they want to, some people want to comply. They really believe in the program altogether, but they want something that's a bit more feasible.
Yeah, so I will say, I mean, that's kind of part of the conversation here for sure. So if you have more specific proposals, we welcome that. I will say that we do have an exemption for financial distress that basically exempts you from the ACPs for buildings in financial distress, kind of from meeting the targets, actually, I think is technically how it's put in. So that does exist in the program already as a flexibility. Now, that obviously doesn't solve the long term for them, but that does exist already today.
So this is something that I'm happy to kind of brainstorm internally of a potential solution, right? On what type of standard score we can set for 2040, the final score for these buildings. That may not be tied exactly to electrification, but is still pretty aggressive, right? Something that we can agree upon. But yeah, we're happy to figure out something internally and come back via email or one of these webinars or something like that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And maybe that's a good pitch, Sam. Do you want to just go to the next slide and we can kind of do the wrap up here and how to provide feedback in the interim?
That sounds good. Bear with me 1 second. Gonna move over to the next session. Yeah, so yeah, if you know, Julian, thanks for your thoughts there, and we appreciate any additional feedback. And you know, if you have more information you'd like to provide on what we've talked about today and these discussion questions or other things that you wanted to pitch, feel free to email us. I'm sure all of you are probably aware of our team email, beps.md@maryland.gov. You know, between now and next session, preferred, so we could, you know, review and bring them up on our next webinar. But you know, also, as you know, this is the ethos of the working group as well. So any feedback that you have regarding what we talk about here, you can also submit via email. Just put a subject line, SAWG feedback, attach any relevant materials you have, and just, again, those are the discussion questions on the screen that you know, we were pitching today. And for next session, we're looking just about a month out, actually. So Thursday, February 19th, we're going to be looking for 2 to 3 p.m. So originally we pitched this working group as bi-monthly, and I think we might have to change up some of the scheduling, but I hope you all will be able to attend on that third Thursday in February for that session. And as always, you know, we really do appreciate you all attending and your continued feedback. It's very valuable for us. And again, this intention of this working group is to bring all these thoughts together and workshop and see what can come out of that to you know, continue to improve the program and implement over the next few years. So Zach, you looked like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in before we end. I realized I never quite fully finished my answer, Julian, to your question as well. So maybe just one key piece of data for everybody here, and we can present on this if this is useful next time. That would be feedback. Feel free to email us. But when Berkeley National Lab did the analysis of our BEPS program here in Maryland, the whole reason for the aggressive EUI targets coupled with the GHG targets is that it leads to efficient electrification. And so they actually saw a 6% reduction in peak demand among Maryland BEPS covered buildings. So when we're worried about like data centers and grid electricity use and all this stuff, like, yes, these are concerns. And that's for us the whole reason we have such ambitious EUI targets tied with the GHG targets. And so what's happening is, as all these buildings are getting, you know, some buildings are electrifying, they're adding load, but they're also reducing, a lot of buildings are also reducing their energy use in total. So that's actually what's bringing the peak demand down. And that peak demand is really what sets the utility costs for large buildings. And so that's kind of, for us at least, one of the North Stars when we're looking at these programs. And when we don't have EUI targets with the GHGs, or they're not very ambitious, you actually see a huge increase in peak demand. And so that's why this kind of dual standard program, back to that really original question, at least we view as really important to kind of get in there. So that's just kind of a little bit of framing, and I'm happy to talk about peak demand next time. But I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that.
Thank you, Zach. And yes, if you could go a little bit deeper into that in the next meeting, that.
Great. Yeah, Chris, if you want to hop on, and then I think we're going to wrap up.
Yeah. I just don't remember. Did the LBNL study include assumptions on new builds coming online, or was it just their initial data set?
I don't remember off the top of my head. So I will plan for next time to give an update on the LBNL study with everybody.
Thanks for that, Chris. And Louisa, I saw your message in the chat. Great question. Will meeting invitations for next session be sent out? Of course. And just wanted to make sure we got the calendar holding for you guys. And so let me just, one more second. Going to drop our email list link in the chat again for anyone on here that isn't signed up. Really recommend you get on there to get the latest on this group and next session. So we'll be sending out the February 19th invite here shortly. So stay tuned, but please submit any feedback to our email in the interim, and we'll see you in just under a month. So thanks, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.